Hi, everybody. I'm John Conway. I'm with Rexel Automation Solutions here in Western New York. I'm the automation sales manager. And normally we've been doing tech talks over the last few months and part of a year. And this is our Tuesday one. We're excited to actually have Dwayne Edwards from Rockwell. He's new to Rockwell, but not to the industry. Dwayne, how many years were you at Cisco? Over 20?
Yep.
So he's a wealth of knowledge on the networking, and you don't want to hear me talk, so I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of what I'm sure are your busy days. Hope to make this a useful bit of your time, and in that vein, I want to teach you something. I want to teach to predict the future. So here we go. The simple secret to predicting the future, in my experience, is to look at things that are happening and tell everyone that you think that that's going to continue. So we're going to do a little exercise here. The first and foremost is this question. I want you to think about this, right? Is your network going to become more or less vital production in the coming days, months, years? Is your leadership going to ask for more or less data from the shop floor for making decisions? And I think you get the idea here, right? It's just looking at what's going on today and taking some amount of time to just plan for what's going on, and specifically around the idea of networking the shop floor. We're going to go through some things that have happened in the past and some trends that are going on today, and hopefully give you some ideas about how to maybe look at what's going on, how to maybe remediate some problems, and how to plan for the future. Because the last one I want you to do in terms of predicting the future is if you look at planning and execution for any networks, but especially shop floor, are those changes instantaneous, or do they seemingly take forever? And of course, we can define forever as we go through. So, I want you to kind of keep some of those things in mind as we walk through these slides, and sort of how you've treated it in the past, and maybe, how you might work on changing that, and how you work for them and work through them in the future. So, we look to the future there for a second. I want to look to the past, and I want to look to the past really in the lens of sort of why the things that happen and are happening continue to happen. And we're going to talk about sort of both sides of the wall, right? Enterprise and IT, and then, shop floor and OT. And I probably use a lot of those phrases interchangeably as we go through here. I wouldn't get too hung up on the words, but if you look at what has happened sort of since the early 80s and the evolution of the personal computer into, basically all forms of IT and enterprise compute around the world, and then really even in the last decade, a lot of the things that have happened with smartphones. And as John said, right, we're going to supply the slides, so I don't want to get too hung up on the slides. We're just talking about lots of stuff, right? And really to the point where at least a part of the problem became inventory and continues to be inventory. And what has happened over the years to drive some of the problems and some of the solutions that have been applied to those. And so you get a pretty large body of experience. You get a lot of pendulum swings between treating IT as an extremely valuable part of the ecosystem that is our business, but then also, in many cases, a very large budget. And then that looks, depending on leadership of your company, how do we slim these down? How do we automate? How do we do inventory control? What sort of processes, policies, procedures do we apply to these vast numbers of resources? Obviously, depending on the size of your organization, to work through issues, right? And so we'll talk about some of those policies and why they may or may not apply well to the shop floor. But there's a reason why there's some pretty harsh, if you will, standards or long-standing, and I think what sometimes appears to sort of those of us on the OT side of the business is inflexible. But a lot of standards that help them do their jobs better. And the one thing I'll call out here is, and I lived through this, I was in security and selling security at Cisco during what I think of as sort of the year of the worm, or the early 2000s, where many different kinds of malicious software, malware, ended up crippling IT's ability to do anything. So you had all hands on deck, you had consultants, you had additional staff just going through over and over these companies where they had to clean up PCs and get rid of bad software. And that really drove us toward what happens today in terms of what for a long time was called Patch Tuesday, but really is this whole idea of patching and updates, which is one of a number of things that I think continues to be contentious through many of us. And I'll just give you a quick picture, right? This is what happens when you don't have standards. This is what happens when you don't have cabling standards in a data center. So you can imagine trying to work on that in any meaningful way, right? So that's kind of all I have on that. I don't want to belabor the point, but hopefully give you some ideas about why and where some of those came from. If you're in IT, I'm sure you're very familiar with them. It's not a hard concept to grasp if you're not. So I certainly believe relatively strongly that understanding why things happen help build some understanding of what, quite frankly, can sometimes be a contentious relationship, right? And maybe some of you guys live that or continue to live that. Now, for the other side of us, right? If we look at OT, and again, I'm not going to call out everything on this slide, but if you think about even from the very early days today, the contrast here is a lot fewer number of devices. In most cases, very specialized. Certainly, in many ways, a much longer history of networking. Those networks were typically proprietary, small, quite often based on some serial type of or proprietary type of technology. And then kind of what's going on today, if you will, is, and I use today sort of loosely, right? But a lot of transfer over to Ethernet technology, in many cases, a very direct encapsulation of some of those old serial messages just into Ethernet technology. And I think, again, if you look at both sides of that wall, somewhat of a lack of understanding of what that actually means. And we're going to go through that. But the big trend here being more and more devices, right? More different kinds of software, more data being asked for. And in most, if not all instances, because of the sort of slow evolution of the network on this side, is a very direct replacement of very old topologies onto newer topologies, and an overloading of, a single use type of network with more and more needs, right? And they'll call out here a real disconnect between a lot of different lengths of life cycles, right? I certainly still walk into plenty of plant floors that have 100+ old machines that still make money for the company, right? And nobody wants to toss those out. But the automation and controls, if they exist, have a very different lifetime, and then the pace of change has a very different lifetime. So some of the things that are going on there, and I typically look at this and say it's an upside down pyramid, and I got lots of examples of this, but we're talking about a very large amount of revenue, again, depending on the size of your company, multiple millions of dollars, and then a lot of money sunk into production equipment and people's salaries, and then that laying on top of maybe tens or depending, hundreds or even more thousands of dollars of automation controls onto some relatively inexpensive networks that, for a variety of reasons, are often not put in or put in as an afterthought. And some of you may have experienced this, right? Put in a suboptimal way. And I've certainly walked into enough plant floors where people had Netgear or things that where they had run out and bought very inexpensive unmanaged switches at the very last minute, right? Because they had to get a job done. And I think that if there's a takeaway from this discussion today, it's we need to step back from our very busy jobs and think about what's going on today, and realize we might not always be able to budget right away or fix things today, but really analyze and look at what we have and maybe how we can affect some positive change. So back to this, right? It's our network will become more vital to production. I feel pretty confident in 99 out of 100 cases that's true, and certainly the more thing I see every day is more OEMs providing smarter machines and therefore having a very complex network as the result of that, and that may or may not have happened to you already, but I feel pretty confident in most cases that is what's happening. So to shift gears for a moment, right, and talk about what does this all mean, and there's things I think that we can pick up and take very easily from the enterprise side, if you will, of networking that are very valuable. And then there's things that maybe need some modification or in the past have been points of contention. And first and foremost, I will tell everybody that the idea of having good documentation, the idea of having a good inventory, configuration management databases, in other words, some good backup and some good ideas of what configuration management. I hope that's not a alarming or upsetting idea. I don't feel like it is, but I also find that it is the kind of thing that perhaps doesn't get time allocated for. And whether that is the old-fashioned time is money, whether that is you and specifically the people that work in your company taking some time, or using a company like Rexel to bolster some of those ideas and really take the time to understand how things are connected. So line drawings, documentation from that standpoint, grabbing in any and every case the ability to understand the configuration of obviously your controllers, but also just as importantly the networks and the networks they're attached to. These are vital, right? And it's a relatively low lift. If you look at, again, back at the pyramid, those are things that are very valuable. You can pick those up, I think, very whole, in whole cloth from enterprises. And quite often, again, depending on the size of your company and some of your own policies, there may already be that kind of documentation, people that specialize in that, folks that can lend you the hand in terms of building those things or grabbing those configuration files, those backups. In the same vein, this whole idea of lifecycle management, I think that many of us often feel almost heroic, right? I talk to folks all the time, right? Very proud. Hey, I continue to keep this very old networking gear, this very old controller system running long past its life cycle. I very carefully like to share with those people that that's maybe not the best case, right? Because it's all well and good while things run in steady state, but I know in most cases that makes all of us somewhat nervous, including the people that are doing it. So just taking that idea that I've got a life cycle, I put something in, I put it in last week or last year or 5 years ago. How long do I truly feel like there's a economic reality that says, how long should this last, right? And fill in your own number. I threw out 15 there. I know people are running much older stuff, but at what point has that really become suboptimal, right? I'll just say it. I'll say it that way. And when does it start costing a lot more than it should? And when do you have a place where I'm out of budget, I'm out of time, I've got a downtime, I can't find the parts. So, from that standpoint, looking at policies, developing your own policies with some modification, looking at trouble tickets, actually entering in shop floor networking problems. What do you do when there's problems? Do you ever escalate to IT? Are they a part of that? Are you, contracting with a Rexel or a Rockwell to do these things? Just keeping track of that stuff can often tell you, gee, I had no problems. Then I had intermittent problems. Now I'm having weekly problems. That tells you that thing's about to fail, right? And so I won't belabor the point there. I probably already have. There's also a number of policies that are valuable that should be enterprised. First and foremost, I think, again, this whole idea of patching, right? Rockwell has our own patching page. If you don't know it, here's a picture of it. You can find it pretty easily. Let us know if you can't. But we go out and we do all the testing of the Microsoft patching and how it affects Rockwell. Obviously, we're not the only game in town, but most major manufacturers of the type of software that we build has the same thing. It is important to keep up with these things, and it is at least too important, I believe, to build a policy and measure yourself against that policy. And in many cases, that doesn't even exist, right? Network management, same thing, right? We often can't use the enterprise tools because they tend to be heavy. And as the picture here on the bottom left shows us, right? We've got a few more words to say about this, but they are typically somewhat fragile, right? Or brittle in terms of the way IP stacks work on our devices. So from a network management system, we need to have it. That doesn't mean that we use what our brethren on the IT side has, but it is important, and network monitoring is important, right? I've got a few more words to say that. And security solutions, again, we need to be aware, and we need to have our own plans for security. Also, again, enterprises run a very different kind of security, so that might not be something you would want to pick up, but certainly in most instances, InfoSec in many corporations has a reach into the shop floor as well. Educating the folks on that side of why maybe these things don't work quite the same or can't work quite the same on the shop floor is a valuable investment of your time. And if that's something you're not comfortable with, a resource again that Rexel and Rockwell can play in your environment. So those are some things that maybe don't fit well. And let's look really again here at this and how some of these things affect design criteria. Back to the past, right? I would contend that for most instances, enterprise networks these days have gone through a lot of the pain and suffering that they're going to. The use cases are similar today as they were a decade ago. You could argue that there's more video, there's more remote access. But if you look at maybe the hundreds or thousands of end users and endpoints that are over there, they haven't changed significantly. When you go in to do a big design or redesign or refresh of an enterprise network, it looks pretty much how it has for a while. And that's okay because they haven't changed. The primary driver there, end of support, right? End of support from a manufacturer will absolutely kick off a refresh cycle on the enterprise side. Big changes now. Hey, you might want to upgrade your bandwidth. From a price perspective, it's probably about the same. Security becomes more important every day, but they look the same, okay? Not so much for us, right? Operational networks are still evolving. As we said, one of the big trends is more and more devices, more and more data coming off the shop floor and traveling, through hopefully some firewalls or security type devices, but more data-driven needs, more looks from leadership in terms of security. So that very brittle network really needs to be thought about somewhat differently in terms of design. And data collection, upstream flows. I hear people talk a lot about resiliency, but I don't see a lot of evidence that that's being taken into account. So now is the time, quite frankly, to look at all these pressures and changes. And while you might not be investing in a new network today, certainly I would contend, and one of the things I'm going to ask you at the end here is think about what you need and when you might need it. And I think if you look at some of the drivers for change, that might change your plans over the next few years. So I'll leave some of that to the end. I don't want to belabor the point, but I am going to say this one more time, right? Is on the enterprise, you've got this thing called Windows, and it's been around since 1985. And boy, does that make me look and think about my age in the industry, because I remember those. But those were somewhat brittle back then, right? The TCP/IP stack, in other words, the software that connects these devices to the network back then, broke constantly. And over time, and over what some would say is 1.5 billion devices, it's been tested, and it's been fractured, and it's been broken, and it's been repaired. And so that side of the network is actually pretty good from just a hard to break kind of standpoint. I'm not talking about security. That's a whole different point. I'm talking about, hey, if I ping or send bad packets or a bunch of other stuff to my laptop that runs Windows 10 on the Rockwell network, you're going to be hard pressed to destroy it unless you just flood it with packets. Lower left-hand corner, not so much, right? Devices on the shop floor have not been subjected to that ugliness. May not, is certainly not anywhere near as homogeneous, may not have been supplied by a big company that could afford to do a lot of testing, may have been third party bought of a stack, right? But and again, my point is, you can knock those things over sometimes just by sending a ping to them, much less SNMP queries or security kind of traffic or what have you. So again, from that standpoint, those devices need to be looked at, and you might look at who's actually supplying that and what are they using for software. Right. So a quick recap. Right, and I don't think this should shock anybody, but my ask of you today is to just kind of stop and think about it again if you haven't lately. On IT, right? We've said it a couple times, and the endpoint is a general purpose computer or a smartphone, which again has been through lots of trials by fire. It is very forgiving of errors or downtime, not the least of which is, hey, I can go do something else. If my computer breaks, I can get on the phone. Now, increasingly, it's not true, but I can get on the phone. I can do some other work, what have you. Lifecycle, 5 to 7 years. Pretty standard architecture, right? Everybody at, well, I shouldn't say everybody, a very large percentage of people at Rockwell, if you work in the office, you've got the same device or similar device. On the shop floor, obviously, very specialized computer. In fact, we don't even call them computers, but that's what they are. And the user, if you will, is a machine. So if there's an error, if there's downtime, bad things happen, right? The money flow stops. In other words, production stops. I go from, hey, this email may or may not to get here right now, to this is extremely important in terms of human safety, in terms of production, transferring things from raw materials to finished goods, and the life cycle, right? 15 to 20 years, and some people would argue even longer. And the people operating it, and I think this is an important thing. It's not their primary job, right? The network isn't as big, although it's important. It's not as big as the enterprise networks, and so you don't have typically as big of a staff, if any. You've got one guy that's probably primarily an automation control engineer that also has to do networking, and not to cast aspersions on somebody who has a very hard and important and necessary job. Probably not classically trained to do this. So from the risk management side, and I mentioned this already briefly, right? IT has to manage data and intellectual property, important things. OT, we've got to protect people, and we've got to keep the, I used to always say, you got to keep the money printing going, right? Fault tolerance for IT, typically as you go toward a data center or toward the core of a network, becomes more important. At the edge, if there's 20 people down, we'll get to them. And it's not that it's not important, but everything varies. For all intents and purposes, there isn't a part of the OT network that isn't important. If it breaks, it's probably predicting, it's probably hurting production in some way, shape, or form. We've heard time and time again, right? From IT, it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. On our side, safety first. Right? Human safety first, absolutely. Then availability, then integrity, then confidentiality. So a very different view of the world. Outages, yep, they're important in IT. OT, they're even more important. So a little review, right? So what can we do about this, and how do the trends that are happening in our space today affect us, and then probably more importantly, what can we do about them? And of course, when I say this, I'm really talking about how they affect networking. We'll talk in a later series about how they affect security. But to me, really, you might argue the order I've put these in. But to me, I've talked to so many customers all the time about one way, shape, or form is I need more data. And it might be as simple as, well, we didn't have a historian and we're installing one. Or it may be, sort of the bigger, more important one is I've got to get analytics. I've got to understand more and more about what's going on the shop floor, whether that be things like, predictive maintenance, which is a big one that you hear all the time. But really, I just need to get more data out about how do I drive additional costs out? How do I make things more efficient? How do I even get a handle on measuring a variety of things like efficiency, like effectiveness, such that I can make decisions? And maybe those decisions may be where to put in a new line, or how can I make that shop floor more efficient? Whatever those business needs you guys identify and can identify all the time, that can be had better and made better through more information, more data, and putting that data and that traffic up into enterprise analytics or machine learning or dashboards or what have you, right? Because as we look at that, and we look at that overall trend that most people call digitization, what we see is, right, lots of science experiments, an uncovering of complexity, a lot of issues around connectivity. So if you don't have a good solid foundational network, very hard to move on from there. Steady state now, it may be working fine, but I start adding in sensors or telemetry or just the generic IoT stuff that we talk about. That tips you over the edge, right? I can't change, and I can't change quickly. I have no agility based on the fact that I have to upgrade networks that may be decades old before I can go any farther, before I can scale, right? So again, back to first principles, if I am going to embark on this, I need to budget and look at that project and say, very first thing I need to do is one way or the other, overlay a new network, put in bolster or empower or improve the existing networks, look at how I do convergence and both protect my existing traffic that is probably automation, maybe motion, maybe safety, different kind of things. I need to protect that and at the same time provide bandwidth and scalability for other things, right? So as I look at that, I say, and this is actually a very old 2011 Aberdeen Group networking study that I don't know that it's changed significantly today as we look at the numbers. So, and if you add up the bottom three and read this, right, I need to consolidate, I need to expand, I can't build or support new applications. 64% of us are just, my network is not ready. So take this as a cautionary tale, right, as to if I was asked tomorrow to provide additional bandwidth or capability to provide data, in other words, the first one, improve visibility, could I do that? And could I do it reliably? Right? And this is depending on your particular vertical, right? You may have been through this, right? If you've got various kind of governmental oversight or regulatory issues, this may have already happened to you. I may have to provide data in terms of serialization or what have you on things I do if I'm a drug maker, right, for example, or a food provider. Trend number two, what is the current and continuing or coming IT and InfoSec influence? Because this is certainly a change I see all the time, right? More and more, corporate wants to get a little bit more involved, and I don't think that's evil, but it does have some ideas around where do you draw lines, an ability to work together rather than antagonistic. Apparently that's a hard word for me today. Working relationship. What is the relationship if you as an automation control engineer or shop floor guy, if you will, what do you do when you have problems, right? Is your first call somebody like Rexel and Rockwell, or is your first call to your IT staff? Where do you draw this line? It's somewhere in that red circle, right? And it does vary, but I think a definition helps. An escalation idea helps. Again, back to the beginning, how do you deal with backups? How do you deal with some procedures and policies that IT has that are valuable? Again, I don't have a solution other than to say defining that when there's a problem is probably a little too late, right? Defining that early and often is good, right? And this is a trend that continues, and it really comes down to this: we need to get our life cycles in order. We need to actually have a definition of them, and that's an enterprise thing that has been pretty well defined over the years. And if you look down at the bottom, it typically is a vendor announces some sort of end of life. And when I worked at Cisco, it was pretty predictable. We would tell you 5 years ahead of the actual date of end of support in every instance possible. Now, right, we didn't always have complete control over our supply chain, so sometimes we got a little surprised, but by and large, we could do that with a lot of predictability. Hey, 6 months from now, we're going to quit selling it. Then a couple of years from now, we're going to quit selling support. And then 5 years from now, that's it. I can't help you anymore. And quite often, again, those drove refresh cycles. Rockwell, we have a pretty well-defined system. We give a lot of notice. We work very hard to, and I'm not trying to make this into a commercial, guys and gals, but we work very hard to make that as long as we can make it. At the same time, right, I do know people run way past it, right? The "you are here" thing. And right, when we look at that, we call that the bathtub, because Lifecycle is you install it, you have some early failures, then you have a pretty steady state and long run of intermittent and random failures. But then when you get down toward the end of the life, they start breaking. And, that raises our support costs, right, wrong, or indifferent, right? We pass those on to you. And then there just comes to a time where it's too expensive and the thing is probably, quite frankly, probably technologically extremely dated, if not really horribly end of life. But they live on, right? So I'll leave it at that, right? And then these aren't necessarily the trends or things I put in order, but a couple other things I would just certainly work on. And a couple slides here. I apologize. It's not meant as an advertisement, but it's the things I use and breathe and live every day. Is I continue to see a lot of networks that are not put in any kind of resilient way, and this is uptime, right? I just talked to a customer just the other day. We're putting in a linear ring. What are the limits on this linear ring? How many devices can I put on it? And way down this path. And I, we talked for a while, but I finally said at the end, I said, guys, why are we not closing that loop? All of the hardware you just talked about, all of the things you just said in terms of building a linear topology for your network can be fixed if you just take the device at the very end of that line and wrap it around. And yeah, we might have to buy a piece of fiber, but wrap it around to the beginning, and then you've got a ring. And then if that one of those links breaks or fails, we don't have an emergency on our hand. And there was a lot of discussion about price, and I kind of took them to task a little on the upside down pyramid. And look, we all want to be good stewards of our company's money, but I think those are the kind of things that need to be looked at and talked about a little more carefully than they have been. And I think that directly relates to this, right? That's the cost of downtime, and every one of those is different, and how you look at expenditures on networks are different. And I'm happy to go over those with anybody that feels like they want to have that conversation. But I will say that the very hidden cost is this right here. Is it broke, right? The bottom left, and 8%. You can apply your own number. But how long does it take to figure out, is it actually broke? Now sometimes that hits you right in the face. Okay, I get that, but not always, right? Then, and I would contend that 21 is low. Then it's what actually broke. And again, we look at the trend of it being more complicated all the time. That number, and we look at staff and staffing and our own abilities. That number is a very important number. It takes a long time to diagnose the problem. Then who comes and helps me fix it? Can I fix it? Okay. I mean, apply your own numbers here. So a huge amount of time and therefore a huge amount of cost associated with this before anything even happens, right? And this is why network management and monitoring and all these other associated things become so important to us. If I can reduce these times when the proverbial stuff hits the fan, then I'm that much better off. And it isn't the kind of thing I think about in steady state or every day, right? The other thing is new projects. Right? If you have a new project, you have to budget for networks. And I'm only applying here a fair amount of my experience here at Rockwell and an even longer tail of that at Cisco. And I'm not going to name names, but if you look on the right-hand side, that is a depiction of tire making machinery. It's a picture, not a depiction, sorry. I was out west, I'll just say it. I'm based in Cleveland, Ohio. I was out west and just happened to be visiting a customer on a couple-day trip, and they had been moving all this new, and this isn't their picture, moving all this new tire making equipment. $200+ million worth of tire equipment. And basically the guy that was putting it in, or one of the engineers of the OEM that's putting it in, comes up to us and he's more or less waving an Ethernet cable at us and says, well, where do I plug this in? And obviously that planning and that design and that manufacturing of the equipment took, many months. And the answer to where do I plug this in was a shrug of the shoulders, and I think the word was eh. So I got to witness a good customer of mine, Cisco's, run out to Best Buy and buy some very inexpensive Netgear network equipment, right? So again, upside down pyramid, $200 million worth of tire making equipment sitting on top of some devices that are made for your home network, not for an industrial Ethernet application. So I've probably belabored that point as well. Resources, gentlemen, ladies, CPWE, if you don't know, it's a document that has had tens of thousands of testing hours put behind it. Lots of people have spent a lot of time building I believe it's 565 pages today. It's constantly updated. It's modular. It changes. There's been additions to security and cloud and all kinds of stuff. I highly recommend looking at this, going over at least the first couple chapters, which are great. It explains some of the problems. It explains some of the issues, some of the design criteria. As it goes farther and farther into the document, it gets more technically specific, and therefore, probably the kind of thing you use when you're in the thick of design. But the first couple chapters are invaluable in terms of kind of understanding what's at stake and what can be done. And again here, right, Rockwell and Cisco spent a ton of time putting this together, and it's really built also for the people that we kind of know, right? It's built and looked at, and there's sections around. Hey, if I'm a control systems engineer, right, I look at these parts. If I'm somebody working with IT, I look at these parts. There are sections for IT. So it is built out very clearly and modular and with certain people in mind on how to execute on these designs. So a little advertisement, free resource. We'll send out the links to everybody. I don't have them all listed today. I want to have an excuse to send you a little email that just says, here's some of the things we talked about today. Here's where we can do some additional reading. So last and certainly not least, in my own personal sort of call to action here around some of the things I've talked about today is take some time, right? It's very easy to put our head down and work on the things that demand our attention on a day-to-day or minute-by-minute basis, and it's often very reactive. But I always, run my calendar and sort of my ideas around taking some time out to understand that I've got to spend time on the future, right? Look at the time. Am I having problems today? Are they things I should kind of quit ignoring? Should I kind of quit band-aiding them and do something real about them? Because sometimes, right, I've got to go in and put in a request for money, and sometimes I have discretionary funds, and a lot of times, especially when it comes to network, those needs are above those discretionary funds, and it's quite often hard to go ask for money mid-year. But what is our best way forward? How can I prioritize? Is there a way I can buy a few things now, but ensure that they fit into an overall plan, right? By making that plan, right? Because I hate to see people throw money away, right? Based on budget. So can I buy the right thing for tomorrow that will fit in today's network, but also fit in tomorrow's plans? Where am I in the bathtub, right? Where is the support cycle? Am I am I into that far end of the right, where I should be concerned about asking for money to replace or renew, and certainly into that whole calculus of multivariant expressions, right? What is my leadership asking me for? Am I trying to do better or more automation of things that are maybe older? Where are we in data collection? What am I going to be asked to do next year? Where are we in terms of connecting things? And again, what kind of things can I leverage and ask? The enterprise IT folk who, they have their own responsibilities as well, but sometimes adding a few more devices to something they're already doing, if it makes sense, is just smart for everybody. So with that, John, I'll hand that back over to you. Because I'm presenting, I haven't been able to see any questions, so that's all I have.